Okay. All right. I would like to welcome all of you tonight. My name is Pat Portwood, and Wendy Scott and I would like to welcome you to the League of Women Voters second meeting, which is on the topic of criminal justice reform. If you were able to attend the first meeting, you heard Ashley Ravish from the State League of Women Voters address what is AB 392, what is a police use of force policy, and why it matters. Tonight, we will hear from Michael Baldwin and Dan Starr, both members of the Forward Together Committee formed by Mayor Suze Wallen, who stated, positive relationships between the police and our residents are essential to build a city where everyone can feel safe and respected. Michael Baldwin is a community advocate and a paralegal and is one of the facilitators for the Forward Together work group. Dan Starr is a sergeant with the Modesto Police Department and currently supervises the traffic safety unit. He also serves as the president of the Modesto Police Officers Association, which is the union that represents all Modesto police officers. Both they sent me their resumes and just extensive. And Michael, I could have gone on and on about all their background and preparation, but with this, it also says exactly why they really had been chosen to serve with this group that we're going to talk about tonight. So tonight they're going to speak about the purposes of the Forward Together Committee, what the goals are, what the timelines are, how members were selected, and also, of course, they're going to speak to the challenges. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Michael and also Dan. So welcome to the two of you for taking your time to spend with us to educate us. So go right ahead. Michael?
Actually, let me jump in very quickly. We are going to do a question and answer form tonight. Please use the chat function. If you are new to Zoom, if you take your mouse and you hover across the screen, the menu will pop up, and at the bottom you will see, in the center of that menu, you'll see a chat. If you want to ask questions of our speakers, please type your question in, and we'll get to a place in the presentation. We'll all serve as proctor to ask questions. If you have either of our speakers that you specifically want to answer, please note that. Otherwise, I'll ask questions and leave it to both of our speakers to answer accordingly. So now you two can take it away.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
So first, I want to thank you for allowing us to be here tonight. I was asked by Pat if I would be willing to speak to AB 392. And some of the information about Forward Together. And I agreed that I felt like it was really important for me to also invite a member from the law enforcement community to participate in the conversation. I believe in building relationships, and it's impossible for me to talk about how AB 392 might affect me and the community, especially African-American community, without being willing to also listen to what Dan has to say coming from the law enforcement community. I think that's a critical key to us building relationships, not speaking for each other, but allowing each other to be heard and to validate each other's position. And so his position as law enforcement is unique, and my position as a Black individual in the community who happened to have spent 26 years of my life in prison, and now I'm returning back to the community, I have a unique perspective. And so I felt that it was in the best interest of building relationships for me to invite Dan into this space with me in order for me to speak about this issue. So when I think about Forward Together, I was invited to co-facilitate Forward Together with Kate Trumpeter because it was an initiative that was put forth by the City Council and Mayor Suwalen to assess what the needs of the community was in regards to our police and law enforcing in general for the city of Modesto. So as a work group was developed, and it was developed from different organizations within the city of Modesto and the county of Stanislaus, designed to come together to determine some recommendations in three key areas of policing. One would be in policies and procedures. And the other would be in alternative responses. Is there another response that should be made when 911 is called? For most calls, to determine whether or not there should be an alternative response. And the third was for accountability. What type of accountability should be set in place, if any, should be changed? And so that's the task of the work group. And they're not tasked to determine how that looks, or some of it is to get feedback on how that looks, but really to provide recommendations to the city council that they can stand behind. And so that work group has started doing the work, and myself and Kate Trumpeter, we've been facilitating that process. And right now we're about 3 groups in, and we've started the information process. So the first portion that we began was in policy and procedures. So we had a couple of Modesto law enforcement officers came and presented information about the policies that are currently in place. The work group will now start deciphering that information to see if there's any gaps, see if there's any holes in those services, and what recommendations would they like to give in terms of policy and procedure. An ad hoc committee will be placed to take a little bit more careful look of that information, because there was so much information given when it comes to policy and procedure that it was impossible for us to just discern all of that information in one time, in one place, in one setting. So an ad hoc group will be set aside that'll be focused on the policies and procedures. And the same thing will happen when it comes to looking at alternative responses. And when we think about alternative responses, there's some calls that law enforcement are called out to that may require a mental health practitioner to go instead of law enforcement. Some of the tools that law enforcement show up with may not be adequate for some calls, but that's not up to 1 or 2 people to decide. It's not up to law enforcement to decide that by themselves, and it's not up to the community to decide that by themselves. We have assembled this work group so that collectively we can decide what's best, and so that we can make some really sound decisions for the city of Modesto and our law enforcement community. And the third portion will be these alternative about accountability. What accountability needs to be in place, what is already in place, and whether or not we should have a citizens review board with an auditor, whether or not that should be placed on with the Modesto Police Department, if that's necessary or not. Those decisions will be made by the work group. And so we've started that process right now. And that's really what the Forward Together process is about. And it's about building relationships in order for us to have these shared ideals and goals that to come out at the end in the form of recommendations for the city council. And I know that Dan is a part of that work group. And I'd love for him to share what that experience has been like for him so far and what he thinks about the Forward Together process.
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Appreciate you taking time out of your evening tonight and last month and to learn about this process. As Pat stated, I am the current president for the Modesto Police Officers Association. I represent every Modesto police officer, every sergeant, lieutenant, and detective that we have at the Modesto Police Department. So because I'm the president, I was asked to sit on the Forward Together committee. So as Michael said, we've had three full sessions thus far, working through and trying to figure out kind of how the process is going to move forward. We had one earlier this week, and that was kind of the first one that was really the meat and potatoes, if you will, of this process. As Michael spoke about, we discussed our policies and procedures, and there was a presentation about that. So, I'm grateful for the opportunity to sit on the committee and represent the officers of Modesto. I can tell you that the officers care deeply about our citizens, care deeply about this community, and they come to work every day striving to do what's best. So as far as sitting on the committee, it's been a good learning process, a good process. They're naturally, human nature, I think, is that people are concerned about changes, concerned about now about not having a significant amount of say-so in changes that affect them. And so as far as sitting on the committee, that's one of the things that I'm having to address with the police officers that I represent, is that there's concern and fear about what this process may or may not entail and what the end product will be. So I'm trying to calm their fears, if you will, while we work together as a committee to make appropriate recommendations for the council to consider. So far, that's what it's been like thus far. You're muted, Michael.
It's a rookie mistake.
You're not a rookie.
So one of the things that is important to note is that almost everyone that's represented in this work group have constituents that they are connected to. They come from organizations, or they have people that they represent, or that they're a voice for. It's not always an easy task to be asked to come in with an open mind and participate in the process when you have other people who you speak for and who asked you to go in and represent them. And no doubt, I know that maybe the same is for Dan. He has people that he has to speak for. So the process is really a challenging process for everyone, because we may not always get what you might want as an individual, but the goal is to learn how to be in a space with opposing points of views and to have an open, honest dialogue, and to look at data, look at facts, look at basic sound logic and reasoning, and to come up with some common sense adjustments that we need to make in our community, if anything. And so I'm proud of all of those work group members being courageous enough to come and sit in and basically be in a fishbowl to make decisions like this, to be willing to give up sometimes some of their position for the sake of a greater good and a greater whole. So it's not always an easy task. And when you think about like AB 392, for example, that was one of the things that we were going to be discussing tonight. And when we think about that, just common sense is that, when we think about a law coming into play and why it was necessary, you have community members who have a particular position with the original use of the law that with use of force is from the 1800s. And when I think about as a Black man in the 1800s, who was I, right? What role did I play in our society in the 1800s? What role did my ancestors play in the 1800s? And so to me, that makes me ask those questions first when we think about the police use of force. And so when that law was enacted or established in the 1800s, I think 1873 or 72, somewhere around there, I was 3/5 of a man, if that. I was a slave. And so when law enforcement encountered me, they didn't have an obligation to see me as they saw themselves. They didn't have an obligation to really see my humanity. They didn't have an obligation for that. But as a society, when we learn better, we do better. And so I know that we've learned better since 1870s. And so it's time that we do better. Now, whether or not everything in that AB 392, maybe I would have done a different process in order to get there, but it's here now. And I believe that it's necessary, for us to really take a look at the use of force laws that are on the books and maybe make some adjustments to them. How they affect law enforcement, I can't really say, because that's not the shoes that I walk in, and I wouldn't dare to try to speak for them. But I think that if in the past, law enforcement, if they perceived the risk, then they had a right to use deadly force. And today I understand that where perception is born from experiences and from influences. And so perception can be skewed, and it's not always based on fact. And so if that was all it took in order for a law enforcement officer to be able to use deadly force, then I think that was definitely something we should be taking a look at. And so that's my take, and I'm eager to hear how it affects Dan and how it affects law enforcement also.
All right. So to be fair, your statement about the use of force law that we've been using, originating from 1872, 1873, I think there needs to be some an asterisk, if you will, and that is maybe that's where it originated from, and maybe that's where laws that we have today originated from. But obviously, as we have progressed through society and generational differences and changes, those laws have been updated. And so I don't want anyone in here to think that up until recently, we've been policing based off of 1870 laws. That's not accurate. Our use of force laws are updated on an annual minimally basis. There are court laws and decisions that come out on a very regular basis that dictate immediately what we can or can't do. U.S. versus Garner came out in 1984, and that's our most recent law as far as what establishes what law enforcement can or can't do. And that's what the majority of use of force laws are written by and used as a guide to be written across the nation. So I think it's, just to be fair, I want everyone in here to understand that we haven't been policing based off of 1870 laws or standards. Obviously, those wouldn't be appropriate for 2021 policing or community expectations or needs. So I want to get that out there. As far as AB 392, I think that was the question, right, Michael?
Yes.
Is AB 392 and how it affects or the perception of law enforcement? I think that was your question, right?
Yes.
So AB 392, again, I go back to human nature is we don't like change, right? And cops, just so everyone knows, we're all human, right? And we have families, we have the same issues that you all have with kids, and kids not making the decisions or choices in life that we want to make, right? So we're just like you. We just likely chose a different career path. And so cops, though, although they're human, they especially don't like change, and they get apprehensive about change. So that is part of the concern that law enforcement has. Is they just don't like change. They get apprehensive about it. And then there's been, for lack of a better term, there's been a lot of rhetoric on both sides politically about AB 392 and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And so depending on the different voices, influences that you listen to, that could have some effect on it as well. I'll tell you, I nor any police officer, I'm not afraid of change, right? If there's a need for us to change, to update the way that we do things, because there's a better way to do it, I'm all for it. I'm all for it. I'm not afraid of change at all. I just want to ensure that whatever change comes or that is implemented, that it's done for the right reasons. It's done to make our community safer. It's done to make the everyday job of policing the city of Modesto easier and safer for our officers, and that it's not done because of political pressures that are more ideology based than static driven. So I think that I guess what I'm saying is I'm not afraid of change. I just want it to be for the right reason, and not I don't want to let politics play into how we police the city of Modesto or how law enforcement in general polices the nation. I think the vast majority of police officers come to work every single day with the right intent of wanting to protect their communities and make them safer. Are there police officers out there that do things that make me ashamed? Absolutely. Are there cops out there that do things, and I'm talking broadly, right, nationally? Are there cops out there that do things that don't represent our profession in the way that they should? Absolutely. But that's what we get when we hire from the human race, and that's currently who we hired from. So there are always ways for us to improve. If in some of those ways that we improve have to be mandated via law or court decisions. So that's the nature of the beast. That's how things work. So AB 392, there's some changes in it that change some things for us, but some of it is positive, and some of it may not be viewed as so positive for the law enforcement profession. But again, I think it's always a good thing to look at how we do things and if there's room for improvement.
I appreciate that that clarification about the 1870s, because when we look at things, I'm one of those guys that I like to look at the roots, because we hear things like systemic behaviors, right, or systemic activities, and if we don't look at the origination of it, and sometimes those old things can creep into the new stuff. And so when I think about the AB 392, where it says that it redefines the circumstances under which a homicide by a peace officer is deemed justifiable and affirmatively prescribed. So it basically says that to me, somebody that ain't wearing a uniform but just happens to be in the street, to me, that's like a great thing as a community member, because at a certain point, sometimes as a community member, I felt like an officer could just shoot me and it would be fine, right? He would be able to get away with it, because that was what we had been seeing, whether or not that was the way that it was everywhere, but that was what we would see. And so when as a community member and I see this law come in, it's almost like, I know that when things change, sometimes the pendulum swings really hard the other way. I can only speak from personal experience. I remember when I stopped being as angry as I used to be, I went to like super, super nice, right? Like over the top nice. Eventually I got back to where I still had some meanness, but I had some niceness mixed with it. So I think that when we see a law like this enactment, it may be a deep swing first before we come back to a middle or moderate place in terms of looking at how this law is going to affect us. I think that in Modesto, we've been blessed with a set of circumstances with our law enforcement that the rest of the nation can't speak to. But I think that we don't maintain that by osmosis. We have work that we have to continue to do to build relationships and to talk about things openly and honestly like this, and to have forums like these to talk about some of these laws. I believe that the best way for us to make laws or adjustments is to have all of us at the table and to have a powwow about, what does everyone think, and for me to be someone that's formerly incarcerated and to have a seat at the table, I think is it's a part of the nature of our shift that we're making as a culture and as a community. And is there I think that now would be a good time for us to have some questions.
As we're preparing for questions, could I say something regarding what you just said there? That you kind of spoke to me there, and you were talking about how you felt at one point. I hope you don't feel that way now, but at one point you felt as though a police officer could essentially shoot you, and there'd be no repercussions, and you would be essentially labeled as the bad guy. I think that's what I essentially heard from you.
Yeah.
Right. So, man, first of all, that makes me sad that anyone would ever think that. But unfortunately, Hollywood has not done our profession any service. In fact, they've done a disservice to us based upon movies, based upon TV shows of what they show occurs. And so, again, we're not perfect, right? There's definitely room for improvement at Modesto Police Department and in our profession nationwide. And I'll never deny that. There's always room for improvement. But unfortunately, I think that a lot of times people make their assumptions, their beliefs, their personal truths, which may not be truth, but their personal truths based upon outside influences that are potentially skewed. And so I can't think of any situation that would be acceptable, right? Where a law enforcer could kill someone without any repercussions if there was no reason to do so, right? There was no immediate harm, threat to someone else. Just to walk up and theoretically shoot someone and they get away. There's no way that that's acceptable. So I think that Hollywood and TV has done us a disservice, but I also don't devalue the fact that you felt that way, and it makes me sad that you did at one point. And I hope you don't now. I think you don't. So
Yeah, I've made a shift. There's some communities that I still feel that way in. There's some cities that I can go into and I know that I'm out of bounds. I know that I'm apprehensive, and I just want to also reiterate that it isn't just Hollywood that has done a disservice. It is some officers who have done a disservice, and sometimes us as citizens when we don't sign up to go to our jury or to sit on a jury, because all of our perceptions can be shaped. And I've seen on TV, I've seen some shootings. I've had some friends who have been involved in officer-involved shootings, who the officer should have been in the prison bunk next to me, right? But he wasn't. And he wasn't because of the perception of our society had deemed that, all of our cops were good. And that's the basis that we started from. And we want to be there. That's as a community member, that's where I want us to be again. But the reality is that hasn't been where we've always been. And so we've had some bad apples. We've had some bad cops. We've had some bad policies. We've had some policies that haven't had humanity woven into their fabric. And that's just my take. And so when I think about that, as a Black man in our community, I have been afraid of police most of my life. It has been recent that I have decided to step out in courage and re-engage law enforcement. And I've been blessed to be around some decent individuals who happen to wear a badge. And they start off as decent individuals though. And so I think as a society, we have some work to do. And I think that we have some of our officers who have been victims of crimes, of that they go and serve, that they've been called to go and they have been affected emotionally and cognitively by the crimes of which they had to respond to. And they may not have had the therapy or the treatment that they needed, so that ultimately they became hurt people who hurt people. I've seen some crimes go unpunished in our community that have been inflicted by law enforcement, and they've gone unpunished, and they've gone unpunished for whatever reasons. I just think that we have an opportunity as a society to shift those lenses now, and for us all to be held to the same accountability. I imagine that if my family would have had the opportunity to protect me from the consequences of my behavior, they probably would have. And it would have done a disservice to everyone. It would have done a disservice to me. It would have done a disservice to the people that I harmed. It would have done a disservice to our society, even to my family. It would have been a disservice because I would not have gained the clarity that I needed from the consequences. So we have some of our law enforcement who have not gained the clarity from consequences. And we all suffer because of that. And so I think that when we have bills like these or laws that are shifted, and we have officers like you, Dan, I think I'm proud that you're a Modesto police officer. I feel comfortable when I'm around you and I see you, because I understand you a lot better today, and that the influence of the culture of policing has not taken all of you from you. And I think that you're an influencer now of the culture of policing, and you're part of why the shift is happening. And there is a shift that's happening, because this is not how it's always been. Our law enforcement has made a shift, and it's a good shift. And I applaud your courage for being in a space like this and for staying true to who you are in spite of your role, because you have a difficult role, brother, right? And I don't admire that at all. I don't admire your position. I don't envy it. I would not want to be in it, you know. But I think that we as a community are better because you're in that space, and we get a chance to influence each other. I was a criminal. I made choices that hurt other people, and I needed to be held to account. We have law enforcement officers who are human beings. Some of them make criminal choices, and we have to make sure that we set in place boundaries that can help them to be their best self, and that can empower you and other officers to hold them to account. Because my homeboys that I grew up with may not have been doing some of what I was doing, but they couldn't hold me accountable. They had to have my back because they was my buddies. And sometimes we've had law enforcement who operate the same way. And I'm grateful that we've made those adjustments now, but we're not finished. And it's so important for us not to stop.
Michael.
Yes.
We've got, maybe this is a good time, because
Yes.
we do have some questions in the chat area. I don't know if Amy's going to take over on that, but the first question is one left over from our last time, which is, has Modesto adopted a new policy to implement the 392? And talk a little bit about the training in that implementation. And if not, if we haven't, what are the plans for our use of force policy? Or is that something Forward Together will recommend? It's coming from Julie.
That's all you, Dan.
Yeah, there's actually a couple questions in there, Julie, so I appreciate that. So I'm going to answer the last question first, and it is about the Forward Together committee. The Forward Together committee has the ability to, they will be looking at our use of force policy, and they have the ability to make recommendations of changes or improvements or anything related to the use of force policy. So they have the ability to make recommendations to the council, and ultimately it will be up to the council, city manager, and the chief of police on what we do or do not implement as far as policy change. As far as the Modesto Police Department, so I was invited to attend last month's meeting when Ashley was there, and I was able to listen, and I appreciate that. And some of the things that Ashley talked about best practices as far as policies. She talked about policies on the website, de-escalation, tracking use of force, duty to intercede, and duty to report excessive use of force. And that is one of the things that she and her group believes in. So we do all that, right? We post our policies on the website. We've had de-escalation training at the Modesto Police Department for as long as I can remember. It wasn't as a whiz-bang word and term as it is now, right? Everyone, just about everyone in society is aware of that terminology, and it obviously hasn't been that way. It's one of those I don't want to say catchphrases, but it's one of those phrases going around right now that most people are aware of. But we've had that in place for as long as I can remember. I've been at Modesto PD for 17 years, and as long as I can remember, we've had that some type of de-escalation. Obviously, because of everything going on nationally, there's a push for even more de-escalation, and we are looking at ways that we can improve on that. But I believe that we've been a leader, at least regionally, if not in the state or nation, about de-escalation and all the things that we do to de-escalate situations. So we do have that. We track uses of force as well. We have 3 layers. Every time an officer uses force, it's reviewed by a sergeant, a lieutenant, and a captain to ensure that it's within policy, within law, and within our culture, the way that we want our officers to act. And then if a officer or a police officer uses force more than 6 times within a rolling a 12-month period, it generates what's called a alert, and that alert goes to their supervisor, and then their supervisor looks at all of their 6 previous uses of force and does an analysis of them. After conducting an analysis of those uses of force, that analysis is then sent to the lieutenant. If they concur with the findings, it is then sent to the captain, which is the division commander. And again, that's been in place as long as I can remember as well. A duty to intercede. It's been in our policy, in our use of force policy, that we must intercede. We have a duty to intercede. So that's been in our policy, again, as long as I can remember as well. And we have a duty to report excessive force. So those were some of the things that Ashley talked about as far as best policies with the use of force policy. And so we have done the vast majority of the things that AB 392 has dictated via policy changes. There are some things in the law that have changed as far as how and when officers can use deadly force. And so obviously we've had to modify and update our training to include that. But as far as those things, we've been doing for quite some time. Again, as long as I can remember on the vast majority of those. So Julie, I hope I answered that. If not, let me know. Okay. Yeah, I think you're muted. Pat, if you're talking, I think you're muted.
Yeah, Amy?
Sure.
Amy's going to take.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Amy's going to take. Okay, thank you.
Not a problem. Okay, our next question says, I saw the presentation on policy and procedure, and it sounded really good. So how did Officer Lamentia violate policy, and why do you think it happened? And Carol asked this question, and I'm guessing, Dan, you're the best person to answer it.
Yeah, so
To the extent that you can. I am mindful of that.
yeah, I'm not trying to dodge the question, right? I'm not afraid of tough questions, but that obviously is still a ongoing case that's still going in the courts, and so I am limited as to how I can comment on that. I think I'll say that I think that a lot of what occurred that day was based upon perception, based upon information that officer had. So I don't know that and I think it was Carol. Carol, I apologize. I know that's not really a great answer, but I hope that you can understand the position that I'm in, being the union president and what's going on with that. So I'm not trying to dodge it, but I am kind of limited.
I'd like to say something about that.
Yeah. Could I just continue to ask, when does the public get to know that? How long do we have to wait where we can actually hear, the reasons and what happened?
So I think that will all come out in the court proceedings. And so right now, that's what the fact that, so this is kind of an unprecedented event for us, if you will, as far as the event itself, and then the outcome thus far of having a officer terminated for shooting someone and then criminally prosecuted, right? To the best of my knowledge, it's never happened in our county. So to answer your question, a lot of that information will come out during the court process, and you will likely see how slow the justice system is as we move forward. So that's what's preventing it from being out is the criminal process that is occurring.
Michael, you had wanted to chime in as well, yeah?
Yeah, just as a community member who, when you think about Officer Lamentia being the first officer in this county to be fired as a result of his actions, that's a clear indication that he violated some policy, right? If he had not violated some policy, then he would probably not have lost his job, and he would probably just be on administrative leave pending further investigation or even whether or not criminal charges were going to be filed. The fact that he was fired was a clear indication that there was some clear, distinct policies that he violated. Why do I think it happened? I think, just as Dan said, I think that there was that he had perceived something. And my understanding is when a law enforcement officer shows up to a scene, he's to ascertain the facts. He can't just go from just perception. And where Officer Lamantia may have failed at was living off perception, what he perceived to be true, as opposed to what he can prove to be true. And he may, I'm not for certain, have been dealing with some other stuff. You know, one of the things that I like to help our community do is interact with our law enforcement so that we help them deal with trauma. And to my knowledge, Officer Lamantia had been involved in several shootings prior to this one. And so he may have been induced by trauma. And so that's just my take. And, you know, I don't know a whole lot, but it might have something to do with his reaction that day. It doesn't excuse his reaction. I think that it actually gives a reason for it, and all the more reason why we need to make sure that we do a little bit more checking in with our law enforcement.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that perspective and your perspective as well, Dan. All right, next question. I keep hearing much about officers not being the appropriate people to deal with those with mental health issues. My question is, who will be taking the mental health calls, and what is the difference between use of force by a mental health professional and use of force by a police officer?
That's a good follow-up question to that. I don't know that I've heard that before. It's interesting. So, historically, I think that most would agree that when there's been a community or societal problem that others have been unable to find a solution for, that it's kind of fallen in the laps of law enforcement. And I think that that's kind of where we have ended up with law enforcement responding to mental crises. Hear me loud and clear. I don't believe law enforcement should be going to those. And I have no problems with others who are more properly trained to go to those. But I think historically, it's just landed in law enforcement's lap as well. They can take care of it. So to answer the question, though, there's several different models out there. Some talk of the CAHOOTS model up in Oregon. It's been around, I think, probably one of the longer programs that's been around, where they send civilians, non-law enforcement, with some type of clinician type training. And I think it varies based upon the community and their ability to provide it. And they send them to these calls for service. And let me know if I use cop jargon, because we have a lot of it that doesn't make sense or you need an explanation. Calls for service is when someone calls 911 and says, I need the police for X, Y, or Z. We call that a call for service. So when there's a mental crisis occurring and it generates a call for service, instead of police officers responding up in I think it's Eugene, Oregon, they send these trained mental health folks, right? I don't know to what level their training is. So this has been talked about a lot. So in Modesto, we have Chief Gillespie has recently implemented. We call it, everyone has to have their own term, right? And so we certainly came up with our own term, and we call it CHAT. And for us, that stands for Community Health and Assistance Team. So it's in its infancy. We have wanted, as an organization, we have wanted to go this direction for some time. But I don't know if you are aware, but Modesto has a money problem. And it is hard to hire. It's hard to find the budget to hire people, right? So we actually received a grant that allowed us to hire 4 full-time mental health folks. So I say mental health. I don't believe that they're clinical psychologists or anything like that. I think that they have some additional training in how to assist those with mental health illness and mental health crises that are occurring. They receive more training and have more resources available than the average patrol officer. So we've implemented, this has been implemented now for a few months, I believe. I don't have the exact date, but it's working out pretty darn well so far. And as the police union president, I think it's a great program. I think that it's 100% acceptable and best practice to send non-police officers to the vast majority of calls, including or involving mental health problems, right? There's going to be some that the police have to go to, right? When they're armed with weapons, when they're threatening to hurt other people, when they have a gun and threatening to hurt themselves. Those are ones that we naturally would need to go to. But that doesn't mean that these chat folks wouldn't join us and do their thing while we provide them the safety and protection to the best of our ability. So we're trying to roll this program out. Thus far, it appears as though it's been successful. I anticipate that it's going to be successful. And the next step, though, is identifying a long-term ability to be able to afford it, because this was paid for on a grant. So I don't know how we're gonna afford it. So currently, when I started at the Modesto Police Department 17 years ago, almost 18 years ago, we had just over 300 police officers. We are currently down to 210, and that's from the chief down. And so, it would be, we're at our lowest staffing on patrol that we've been at as long as I've been here. So, those folks that say, well, just eliminate police officer positions and pay for it, I don't know. That's a reality. So I think right now that the difficulty is finding the long-term financial ability to pay for it. But thus far, it looks like it's been very successful. I anticipate it's going to be, and it's something that I know the chief wants to continue, and that I want to continue as well.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to wordsmith this next question a little bit, Diane, so bear with me. So Diane is acknowledging she's not a Black woman, but that based on what she's getting through the news, she believes, Michael, what you've been talking about is being validated by information that she's seeing through news. And this includes perspectives offered by individuals who are high profile. Her question is, does this bill change the accountability issue that, Michael, you were referring to? So does AB 392 address the accountability piece that you were talking about? Diane, I hope I got that. I hope I conveyed that in the spirit in which you intended it.
Yes, sounds pretty good.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
I've read AB 392, and the adjustments that it makes is still it's up to us as individuals and up to law enforcement to be able to discern when that, because the shootings are a shooting can still happen, and it can still has to be judged by a supervisor and by the community on whether or not this was an appropriate act or not. So that accountability, I think the greatest thing that we have going for us when we think about accountability is how we interact with each other. I think that we don't start after a situation has happened to hold someone to account. I think we start before the situations happen. That helps us to hold each other accountable and to be able to hold law enforcement accountable. We can't wait until after a situation where a use of force has been necessary for us to have an understanding and an interaction with our law enforcement community, and for our law enforcement community to have an interaction with us. I think that as a community member, I want law enforcement to first allow themselves to be held accountable by me, so that it makes it easier for me to allow them to hold me to account when I violate something. And so by Dan, for example, participating in this discussion is a way of him allowing himself to be held to account by us. to me, this is where accountability begins, and being able to ask the question and get an answer. So I think that AB 392 doesn't do anything necessarily for the accountability piece unless we build relationships first. Unless we understand law enforcement and they get a better understanding of us as community members. And I think that because we still have to deal with perception, we still have to deal with the way someone might see a situation. And unless Dan walks in my shoes, then he may not understand why I feel the way I feel, or respond the way I respond, or I may not understand the way he responds in a situation unless I be willing to walk in his shoes. So in answer to that question about the accountability problem, I think the accountability problem is a relationship problem. I think that's where that is, you know.
May I answer to that? Hello?
Yeah,
Diane?
Diane, did you have follow-up to that?
Yes, because when I talk about the accountability problem, I'm talking about the fact that right now, the way I know it is that if an officer shoots somebody, he is considered has immunity from being charged.
Yeah, that
except under extreme conditions, very extreme. And that's what I meant. I agree with the rest of what you're saying.
Qualified immunity.
Yeah.
Dan, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different topics within this topic occurring. So first of all, Michael, I agree with the vast majority of what you said. Relationships are so darn important, and that will bridge so many of the issues and concerns that we have as a community. And so I absolutely agree. Community relationships are very important. I've never walked in your shoes and vice versa. And for us to be able to acknowledge that, very important. To Diane's question, yes, AB 392 does add additional layers of accountability. It is very specific as far as when officers may or may not use force, use specifically deadly force in this case. And if a officer uses deadly force in a situation that this law doesn't allow, then that opens them up for criminal prosecution. We are seeing more and more criminal prosecution of police officers nationwide. So yes, this does add significant accountability, or what I think. There's always been accountability, and so I want to choose my words carefully, and I don't want anyone to walk away from here thinking that there's never been accountability. There has, but this adds additional layers of accountability as well. And this law is very specific as to when or when officers cannot use force and in what manner. So I hope that answers it.
Sort of. Thank you.
Okay. Diane had asked the next question, and that was, how often is de-escalation training provided to each officer within the force currently, Dan?
So that's a tough one, because as far as a sit down and talk about, this is a official lecture on de-escalation. I don't know how often we do that, but de-escalation is something that is very important to our culture at the Modesto Police Department. And so it's something that we talk about every day. Is there a lecture about it every day? There is not, but it is something that we talk about in briefings. So in briefings, a supervisor leads that, and then we talk about calls of importance that occurred the prior shift. And we talk about ways that we can do things better, ways that we can improve, things that we did well, things that we didn't do well, right? It's a standard briefing for the business world. And so in those scenarios, we talk about de-escalation. We talk about the way that we do things. And then it's embedded in every part of our training as well. So it's something that I can't give you a quantitative hard number, but I can tell you that it's our culture at the Modesto Police Department. It's embedded in all of our training. It's embedded in the way that we train and want our people to interact with the community. So it's something that we train on, talk about, and is at the forefront of many of our conversations about how we police on a regular basis. So I hope that answered it without a hard number.
Well, it means that you're taking into consideration, but it doesn't give you, it doesn't give me definite, at least some kind of a definite training thing that you can depend on, that is what the end result is going to be, is nothing but de-escalation, and mixed in with just plain, you're giving me the day-to-day routine, and I appreciate that, but I think I would prefer at least a set date, a set time frame of some sort, because things do get lost in the process of everyday routine. I definitely am somebody that knows that.
Yeah, and I apologize, and I don't have that specific answer that you're looking for, as far as how many hours or whatnot that we train on de-escalation. I know that the state of California mandates a tremendous amount of training, and that in just about every area that we exceed it. But I can't tell you what the state, I'm not part of our training unit, so I can't tell you what the state mandates as far as de-escalation, nor could I tell you. I could find it out, but I don't have it with me, so I apologize.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, we have time for just one more question. And so I'm going to apologize because there were additional questions that we weren't able to get to. But the next that I have in the list, as they were sent across, is I'm guessing is another question for Dan to answer, and that is, are all instances, I'm taking some liberties here, so are all instances of violence with officers examined in-house, or is there ever an environment or a circumstance where the standard protocol would be for the review that you were referring to, Dan, be examined by out-of-house participants, by other stakeholders?
Sure. Yeah, so it depends on what level of force it rose to, right? So our most serious uses of force are have that same process I talked about, where the frontline supervisor reviews it, the lieutenant and the division commander. But in our more serious ones, where significant use of force that can be classified as deadly use of force was used or attempted, that use of force, it has a three-pronged investigative component to it. Or a minimum of a three-pronged investigative component to it. In addition to what I just spoke about, it has our internal affairs department investigates it, and then depending on where it occurred, whatever jurisdiction it occurred in, that department will investigate it. Most of the time, those are going to occur in Modesto City jurisdiction, since we're Modesto City police officers. But there are times that our calls take us out of our jurisdiction and we use force, and those agencies would then investigate it. And then the third prong would be the district attorney conducts a independent investigation into the incident as well. And ultimately, the district attorney is the one that decides whether or not laws were violated, whether or not an officer is going to be prosecuted. And so ultimately, a lot of it lies with on the higher threshold uses of force. A lot of it lies with the district attorney and their analysis of the use of force, and whether it was within the confines of the law. And currently, we talked about AB 392. That has defined Penal Code Section 835A, which talks about when and how we're allowed to use force. So ultimately, to get back to Diane's question, ultimately that goes to the district attorney's office, again, on our higher threshold uses of force, and the district attorney then decides whether or not we followed the law, which is mandated by AB 392. So I hope that answered that. question.
You did a good job.
Dan and Michael, are you both willing to put your contact information in the chat? I are a couple of additional questions that we weren't able to get to, but I do want to encourage members of the league and our guests tonight that if they have a desire to have those questions addressed or just want to know more, that there's a way for them to connect with both of you.
I can figure out how to do it. I will do it. I think I got it right here.
Or if not, I know Pat has your information. If you're not opposed to that,
I have
that
the
being made
information.
available. Thank you, Michael. And if you're not
Yeah.
opposed, Dan, if anyone is interested, we can make sure if Dan is who you're trying to reach, Michael put his email into the chat for those of you that can see it and access it. And
Yeah.
certainly when we
And-
follow up from
I
tonight.
just,
Yep. Oh, there it is.
mine's in there now.
There
Yep.
it is.
So
There
when
it
we-
is.
When we follow up after tonight, we'll make sure
Okay.
that information is available. Pat, I will turn it over to you to close us out.
All right. Well, first of all, it was a lot of information and obviously a lot of questions. Obviously, you have the two of you involved in the Forward Together. This is an enormous challenge, an enormous mission that you are on. And I so applaud the time you're giving to it, the time that the committee's giving to it. I'm glad that our mayor is pushing to have this kind of a grouping where we can build relationships and trust and help to make the community an even safer and better place. So it's been very informative. There's probably a lot more questions that we could come up with. And I do appreciate that the two of you have joined us and been right alongside listening to the league. Our goal is to educate ourselves and our community about what's going on with the Forward Together group. And I think that you have helped us tremendously to understand more. And it is a long-term goal. I know that it is for this year, at least into 22, looking to come up with some recommendations. And I would also let our group know that the next meeting of the Forward Together group is November, I think I wrote 15th. And you can do as I have done, which is join, not as a part of the group, but you can observe and listen, and you can offer comments. So it is a very much, if you want to continue learning and being a part of what's going on, I would encourage it. So thank you, gentlemen, so much for your time and for your commitment. And we are lucky to have you both in Modesto. So very good job. Thank you. And to our community, thank you for joining.
Yeah.
So our next meeting, Meet and Learn, is going to focus on another league priority, housing. And we will be having a presentation by the Frobas with their research on the racially restrictive covenants on housing in Modesto. So we're moving into the next priority that is set by the state league. So we appreciate you joining, and thank you. And thank you, Amy, for helping as always.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Yes.
much,
All
everyone.
right. And
Have a good night,
evening to all.
everyone.
Take care, Dan.
Good night.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Bye, brother.
Yes.
Thank you, Pat and Amy.